Good morning, everybody. I hope you've already enjoyed the first sessions. Welcome to what is the closing plenary. And the theme of today's closing plenary is achieving inclusive growth in the fourth industrial revolution, which is also the theme of the annual meeting of the new champions, which is also going to happen in just a few days later this month in Dalian in China. And so in many ways, everyone here gets a first bite of the apple. It's become a hackneyed expression in many ways to talk about a moment in history when we will be judged. And yet I firmly believe that this really is one. The exponential change that we're just beginning to recognize and live through throws up an enormous test to each and every one of us here and many of our colleagues, friends, and families around the world. Will we succeed in bending the arc of change, driven by exponential technology, towards the benefit of mankind, all of mankind, and to the planet? And what would it take for everybody here today to proactively and concretely contribute to that? What's certain is that we will fail unless we do more to tackle what has become untenable levels of inequality. We now face a situation in which the richest 1% of the global population control more wealth than the remaining 99%. Or to put it another way, 8 individuals control more wealth than half of humanity. Now, you've probably heard those statistics before, but it's worth letting that just sink in. What we're going to discuss this morning is what industry can do to ensure that the incredible growth potential of the fourth industrial revolution is genuinely inclusive and that it yields real and recognizable benefits in the daily lives of millions of people who, as yet, many feel that they are not seeing the benefits of what is one of the great eras of change. And to discuss this, we have a phenomenal panel. I've already spoken to them all, and I'm very excited about what you're going to hear from them. We have Mike Ableson, who is the Vice President of Global Strategy at General Motors. Welcome, Mike. We have Paul Alivisatos, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of California here in Berkeley. Welcome, Paul. We have Tan Lee, who's the CEO of EMOTIV, also in the Bay Area. And we have Mayor Sam Liccardo, who's the Mayor of San Jose. Thank you for being with us, Mayor Liccardo. And we have Vivian Tan, who's the Vice President of Strategy and Transformation at Kaiser Permanente. So we have great agents of change in our midst. Mayor Liccardo, I'd like to start with you if we can. You've said that your goal is to make San Jose by 2020 the most innovative city in the USA, and I salute that as the kind of ambitious goal that we need in times like this. And part of what you've focused on is making sure that innovation really does speak to pressing social problems. You've dealt with homelessness, youth employment, raising the minimum wage, many, many different things. Can you just give us an insight to what you've tried that you think tells us about some of the approaches that might work to use the technology that we have now in our hands to reduce inequality?
Well, thank you. First, thanks for having me here. It's an honor to be at World Economic Forum. I represent a city of about 1 million people, which is the 10th largest in the country, and we're in the heart of Silicon Valley, the largest city there. And I'll describe first a bit of a challenge. I experienced this recently, 2 days ago. We had one of those moments every mayor seizes on and hopes to have at some point in their term. Google announced that they are building not a headquarters, but an office and R&D complex that will comprise some 5 to 8 million square feet in the heart of our downtown, which is a wonderful thing to announce. And as I was full of googly giddiness and happy to post and tweet all about it, I was really amazed by the response that came from so many members of my community who immediately expressed frustration and concern about the lack of affordable housing in the community. And rather than everyone sharing in the giddiness, it was clear that here in the heart of Silicon Valley, we have a very serious issue around equity that we all know has been ignored too long. And certainly, there are different competing views of this here in the United States. Tom Friedman came out with a book that said the world is flat. Richard Florida said, no, the world is spiky. But even in the spikiest of areas, and by that I mean the peaks of innovation, as in here in the Bay Area, we have a very serious issue of equity, and it shows up around concerns around affordability and basic access to the economy. What we're seeing is that increasingly companies are understanding this, and we're seeing it in a couple ways. One is we know that the lack of affordable housing is the biggest constraint right now to economic growth in our region. And that's, of course, in the best of times. We also know that the lack of skills, job skills, in the hands of those who could be doing the work and helping these companies expand is also an enormous constraint. The lack of talent, which we now try to utilize because we do not have an education system that provides us with the 125,000 computer science degrees that we would need for an innovation economy, but only provides us with 50,000. We rely on H-1B visas and other mechanisms to bring people from around the world. Right now, we don't have a president that's terribly supportive of that idea of actually bringing people from around the world to help us innovate. And so now we're really faced with challenge, and now we have to think much harder about this issue of equity and how we lift the skills and opportunities for everyone. So around the skills issue, we're trying to see how we can reimagine basic city services like libraries. We think there are opportunities to create job skill training centers in our libraries, or we're partnering with companies like Robert Half International that are essentially giving us the software that we would use to train people to learn everything from coding to accounting to English as a second language, in centers where we're also partnering with various employment organizations to help lift opportunities for those we know are being left behind. We also know even in San Jose, in the heart of Silicon Valley, we have a huge digital divide. And so partnering with companies like Facebook that are launching one project, for example, called Terragraph to provide free gigabit access for broadband through Wi-Fi. We think trying to do more to try to overcome that divide is critical because we still live in a city in which tens of thousands of kids can't do their homework at home because their parents can't afford internet access. And so we're really trying to do what we can to create a platform for the innovative companies and people around us to use San Jose as a laboratory for their latest technologies that can help us address some of these equity challenges. And whether we're a laboratory or guinea pig probably depends on your perspective, but we think this is a promising approach in a world in which we just don't have the resources to fix the problem ourselves.
What would be your, I mean, you talk about the ability or the opportunity to use a city as a lab. And I think, it must be a very exciting time to be a mayor because you have that opportunity to do that, but you also must feel very, very personally the responsibility to individual people. You're working with them every day. What would be your request of industry? What do you need from industry in terms of the partnership that will enable you to deliver that change on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be blunt. As mayor, you spend a lot of time asking people for money. And we are interested in co-investment opportunities that actually matter for companies. To give you a quick example, we're talking to several lean tech companies about the enormous repatriation of dollars we expect with whatever tax bill may come through Congress in the next year. We think there's a path where they could invest with us to build affordable housing, be workforce and rent-restricted housing, and we could essentially fill gaps to ensure that they get a very reliable but small rate of return. Those are the kinds of partnerships we're looking at. Investment, for example, in a San Jose College Promise initiative, where we want to ensure that talented young people who can't afford college have a pathway to be able to get a computer science degree if they are willing to help. And then we can help build out their talent pool for them. Those are the most blunt asks. If they're not willing to give money, we're happy simply to partner with them to see how technology can be an aid.
Fantastic, thank you. Vivian, come to you. Yes. So, I mean, Kaiser Permanente is such a fascinating example, I think, of an organisation that has chosen corporate citizenship in a very bold way. I mean, you've, as a company, committed to being carbon net positive by 2025. To send nothing to landfill, I think, and to use only food from sustainable sources, which is incredible. And you're also a company that has included in its very model this idea of inclusion. I wondered if you could talk to us a bit from your own experience in the work that you've been doing on community health. What can we learn from the experience of Kaiser about how companies can really close that inequality gap practically?
Well, I will first say that we're still on that journey, and maybe share a couple of things about, in about 2013, when our CEO, Bernard Tyson, became CEO. He had a dinner with Kim Kaiser. We have a Kaiser board member, a member of the Kaiser family on our board all the time. And Bernard asked Kim, what would Henry Kaiser think of Kaiser Permanente, 70 years after the inception of our not-for-profit organization. And Kim Kaiser did not skip a beat, and he said, Henry Kaiser would be so proud of all the accomplishments we have done around quality and service, and a whole host of things, but he would, walk across the street and set up a much cheaper health care, more affordable health plan across the street to compete with you. So it was very, very clear that affordability came to the forefront of the organization, and we had to have very open and honest conversations internally about how we have lost our way a little in terms of the importance of high quality and affordability that goes along with that. So we started looking at a lot of metrics. We look at how affordable we are in a certain zip code, what % of the population can afford us. We have brought rates to the marketplace which have been low single digits, which is very hard when you actually look, if you understand some of the underlying drivers of costs in the healthcare industry. It's really difficult to get close to inflation level increases, and yet we don't think it's enough, and we keep working it. A very telling thing that we've done internally that I think has really helped change the dialogue. The most senior people have spent time with our customers and with our average customers. Our CEO, Bernard, sits on phone calls that he takes to our call centers. And we had a member call in to actually dispute a $40 charge because she could not pay for the copay that was $40. This is the level of pain and pressure that our members face. So I think having those stories and actually hearing directly from customers, our senior Southern California leadership team went through a poverty simulation, and they were all supposed to live on, the federal poverty level and feed themselves. And at the end of the week, all of them came to me and they were like, I'm losing it. The only thing I can think about is that donut in the break room, because and it's, I think the need to actually experience things and have a level of empathy for some for our own members and patients and customers is extremely important, and not being out of touch, I think, is extremely important. That's been one learning for us. The second learning is data. Starting in 2006, we always had this notion that when you came and you looked at health disparities, so health outcomes looking across race and ethnicity, that Kaiser, we did better than everybody else, right? And until we saw our own data up close and personal, and you have to go and collect the data first, so that's another conversation we can have. We realized that we were doing better than the industry, but we had the same care disparity gaps across races. And it was a huge wake-up call 5-6 years ago, and we have systematically gone after colorectal screening for Latino men. With the data too, you know exactly which cohort, which age group you need to go and put programs in place. We have gone systematically after cardiac care for African American men. We have increased our colorectal screening for certain populations by 40-50%. It's a funny joke. In Hawaii, we call their moms up if they don't come in for their screening. I think it only works in Hawaii, by the way. And their wives, their moms and their wives. So, there are programs where, and we've been really asking the question, we've been doing a lot of training, cultural competency training. How do you have certain conversations with certain kinds of people? How do you make people comfortable? So all those things start off, starting with data, but putting in very thoughtful programs and helping our own workforce understand the changes that need to be made as well. We have now committed to very, very systematic unconscious bias training across the organization. It is amazing how many unconscious biases we personally carry on a day-to-day basis, and just being aware of that is extremely important, especially when you provide care.
It's interesting what you're drawing out there, because it seems to be a blend of how some of the exponential technologies, I imagine AI in terms of the data crunching, are enabling you to be so much more specific and targeted in the care that you offer, and really addressing communities that would otherwise be marginalized, but also something that's so deeply human, just our ability to recognize what it takes to bring people in to a system, including health, and really make sure that people are included on a human level,
yes,
including by your healthcare staff. Thank you. So if we move on, I want to zoom out a bit to the vantage point that Mike has over the car industry, or really the automation that's happening, which is obviously reshaping not only the world of General Motors, but employment as we know it. And Mike, I mean, what do you think the industry, including companies like General Motors, have a particular responsibility as agents of change in this area? What's on your shoulders?
So I absolutely agree. I think especially large industrial companies have a responsibility both to people and to the planet, and it's something that we at General Motors take very seriously. You know, we sometimes lose sight of the scale of some of these industries. The automakers in the US are the core of an industry that employs 8 million people. We pay about $500 billion in wages as an industry. And through our history in the US, I think we've been an engine to help bring along many people to a comfortable lifestyle, and something that we're very proud of. I would say automation for us is not a new subject. Automation of the vehicle assembly line started as soon as it was invented about 100 years ago, and it's something that we've seen continue to progress over the decades since. So we have quite some experience dealing with automation and what the impacts of that will be on our industry. And it's something that I think, to the point, we're going to continue to see develop, but it won't happen. You know, it won't happen in the space of 5 years that suddenly there won't be anybody working at vehicle assembly plants. It'll be a much more gradual process, because there is so much capital involved in the automotive industry. And so that gives us the benefit of having some time to think about it. And we want to think about, obviously, the people that are currently employed in the industry, and how do we help them move to other industries or learn other skills. But we also spend a lot of time thinking about the next generation, because clearly the children that are in school today, the auto industry will look very, very different by the time they're adults. And so as a company, we spend an enormous amount of time and effort around STEM education, and working even as low as grade schools in science, technology, engineering, and math education. And in fact, yesterday in the opening session, in the video, Mary Barra, our CEO, was actually captured talking about some of our efforts in STEM education. And so, as a company, we see this as very key to, you know, selfishly, we want to make sure we have enough engineers and technologists to support our industry going forward, but it's also the right thing to do for these communities, to make sure that the future participants do have a skill set that will be valuable out in that time frame. So I think we see it both ways, working with, obviously, our current employees, but working with our potential future employees. And it is because we operate in so many communities and are on the ground in so many places, it is one of our core values that we improve the communities where we operate. And groups all around General Motors do amazing things and touch a lot of communities with these sorts of efforts. So To answer your question, absolutely. I think every company should be taking aggressive action on what they can do to make sure people aren't left behind as their industry changes.
And from the vantage point of someone who oversees strategy, I mean, given the pace of change, there's immense pressure on industry and companies to survive, to stay at the head of the pack. And yet, how do you, within the framework of developing strategy for industry, ensure that this commitment, this responsibility also is truly lived out in what the company prioritizes?
So I think, as far as the efforts I just described, it starts with the leadership of the company and with Mary making it clear that it is part of the company culture and the values. Obviously, my job is to make sure the company is still vibrant and successful, even in this very new world that's coming. Now, for us in the transportation industry, we're now starting to talk about an access issue a little bit different, and this has come up in many of the conversations with cities. And how do we leverage this move to autonomous transportation to make access to mobility more broadly available in cities? Every mayor I've talked to, I assume it's probably true of San Jose as well, have groups of people that don't have good access to transportation and therefore don't have good access to opportunities that may exist elsewhere in the city. And so this has turned into a really interesting conversation, and it's been interesting here in the forum in the last couple of days. Access that's not just an industry conversation for us, but a conversation about how the industry works with and interfaces with the wider society around us.
Just before we move on, Liccardo, I know that's an area that you've done a lot of work on around autonomous vehicles and what's happening. Can you just talk to that in terms of what you think the opportunity is there for reducing social division?
Well, certainly, we launched an RFI a couple of weeks ago. We've been in communication with a couple dozen companies in the autonomous vehicle space, and we've identified different corridors where we're trying to solve challenges for the city. One of those corridors help us enable large population that live in several homeless centers where we're helping homeless individuals, including veterans, get back on their feet. We know a lot of those folks are not able to drive for various reasons, physical impairments and so forth, and we think autonomy could be a great solution. At the same time, we know consumers will do better. We know there's a workforce that's going to get displaced, and I think this is a huge challenge for us. And it doesn't mean anyone is going to play the role of Canute and order back the sea. It is coming, and it's really incumbent on all of us to figure out how exactly we're going to prepare a workforce to make this transition.
Perfect segue. So, Paul, you oversee a research empire. I think it's 50 campus research units, 12 research museums, and also research field stations. And Mike and Liccardo mentioned about how education has got to change, how it's got to be much more about a partnership with industry from the very get-go. Can you talk about how you're seeing that already emerge within University of California?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a profound period of change, but also it's important just to step back and take a look at the role that universities play and to have some sense of what those numbers look like. So at Berkeley, if we look at the students who come to us from the lowest 20% of incomes in the United States, and we have 27,000 students, and 30% of them are in that category. So it's a very large fraction of people who are first-time college and coming from low incomes. One-fifth of them, one-fifth of that lowest income group end up in the top 1% of incomes 20 years later. So you get a sense of what a powerful engine of social mobility education truly is. And our challenge is that the demand for it is growing enormously, and at the same time, what's needed in terms of that education is changing profoundly. So we're doing many things to change or to adapt or to enable this new environment. One thing that we are implementing already is we've just announced the creation of a new division or college of data science. And we've run a pilot of it for a couple of years now, and what was fascinating about it is that the demand for it is just off scale. And what it has enabled is many students who did not have the entree to a computer science or statistics degree, but are perhaps studying other subjects at the university, are suddenly able to get access and to be trained in the tools of data science. And the moment those students are enabled to ask a question that they deeply care about, a Native American student wants to understand the history of what has happened to Native American lands in California. That's their question that they come in with. Suddenly, they're able to really get integrated into the modern tools of data science. So we see an enormous uptick in that population, and we're going to enable them. There are 27,000 undergrads at Berkeley at any given time, and we're in the midst of a planning process where we believe it will be possible for us to enable all of them to engage while they're at Berkeley in what we would call a significant discovery experience of some kind. So the nature of their education will change from one that is primarily classroom-based to one where there's significant experiences that they define, but they can do in partnership. So partnership, there's no way we can achieve that kind of scaling without extensive partnerships with companies and other organizations that could enable those kinds of things to happen. So we see a profound change happening there as well. And finally, we're looking very hard at ways in which although these are large numbers, they're still quite limited. What are other ways in which we can enable more people to participate in the educational community that we have, which is very powerful? What are more ways that we can achieve that goal? And there are many ways in which we know that we can increase those, including much deeper partnerships with Cal State East Bay and other, the San Jose State and other educational institutions that have, even larger footprints than ours. So there's a lot of planning and thinking around that going on right now.
I think it's really particularly interesting as we think about how you broaden access. I mean certainly, the Rolls-Royce of a UC Berkeley degree is not accessible to everyone, but we're working on ways in which, for example, through Cal State, how we can create a 3-year computer science degree so that students aren't suffering and trying to pay tuition through 5 or 6 years it's often requiring. Or, for example, how we can partner with employers who will identify those job skills that they need that can be satisfied with a 12-month certificate, an 18-month certificate that can enable someone to get a technology-enabled job and have a clear market signal that this is a person that they can employ who may not be able to take time off because they're a single mom with 2 kids, can't go to school for 4 years. That is where I think there's going to be a lot, there's already a lot of attention, and hopefully we're going to see much more innovation. How can we create credentials that enable people to be able to get these kinds of jobs without the Rolls-Royce degree?
And that's, just given how education is changing at the macro level and how we'll all have to learn continuously throughout our lives, learning on the hoof, learning on the move is going to have to happen, and hopefully that will open access, as you say. Tan, so Tan, you're an award-winning entrepreneur and somebody who has used presumably the education you received in this area to use some of these incredible technologies for social good. Maybe you can tell us a bit about what you do, but what inspires me about EMOTIV is in many ways it's democratizing our understanding of the brain, and how are you using that for social good?
So just to give you an idea of what it is that we do, EMOTIV is a company that is really on the cusp of this idea of the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is about the merger of the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds, and how we interface with the biological organism is through the neural interface. And so what we do is we have a non-invasive device that picks up electrical signals from the brain, and we use that to allow you to do 2 things. One is to control the external environment. So we recently had an example of a paralyzed person who was paralyzed from the age of 18. For 27 years later, he was able to drive a Formula 1 car just using his thoughts, using our technology. And we can also use this sort of technology for monitoring and feedback. So whether it be understanding how a driver feels in an autonomous vehicle, or how students participate in a classroom and the social cohesion that is involved in that process, and how that might extend to a massively online course in order to better tailor experiences to the individual. So there are a lot of opportunities for using this technology, and one of the reasons why we exist, and when we founded this company, we know that there are 7 billion brains out there, each one of them unique. And so the challenge for us was to create this technology in a way that was fundamentally inclusive, because we know the stakes are very significant if we create it in a way that made it unaffordable for many. And I was very inspired by the models of innovation and the wealth creation and the innovation and entrepreneurship that is fostered by models around the internet and the web. One of the things that concern me on the subject of inclusion, as we look at the fourth industrial revolution and some of the underlying technologies that will fuel this revolution, is that it tends to be centralized among some very significant enterprises. Unlike the internet and the web, which was designed by the forefathers to allow innovation to happen around the periphery and to really decentralize who can participate in the innovation, what we're seeing with this new drive of this new raft of technologies, specifically, artificial intelligence, is so much of it is really centralized amongst some very large organizations, and so that creates a new rules of engagement, and so it puts a much more significant responsibility on the business leaders to do more in this context to ensure that there is social inclusion, because of course we can do things like translate brainwaves so that we can facilitate citizen science. We can make tools much more easy to use so that we can foster citizen development, right? So that more people can participate in coding. But that really will only allow the tinkering at the application layer. We can't really fundamentally change some of these core technologies because it takes so much time and cost to fundamentally build them. So I think this puts a much more of a significant onus on business leaders as we build these new technologies to do more and to think more about social inclusion and equality.
What could be a response that, Mike, go on.
I'm sorry, I wanted to back up to a comment that Sam made that I thought is really important on this thinking about opportunities that don't require a four-year degree. And we've started to do some of this thinking. We know that in the world of autonomous vehicles, there will be all sorts of jobs for very sophisticated data scientists and engineers and so on. But what about the mechanics for autonomous vehicles? What sort of skills do they need? And that's not a four-year degree. And how do you think through, in your industry, we can all name the jobs that are going to be lost, but where are the opportunities? And how do we start looking forward to that? And how do we start setting up programs with education and academia that will prepare people to take those sorts of jobs? I think it's important that we try and get ahead of that. And I think there is a lot of opportunity to bring a lot of people with us then through this technology change.
Let's take other thoughts on this, because I think there's something that both of you raised there. From Tan, I think, how do we make sure that what is happening, we blend into that an inherent decentralization? We're not seeing a situation in which some of the technologies actually exacerbate the concentration that we talked about at the beginning of this. So when we're looking for the opportunities, what are the opportunities to not only spot for the new kinds of roles, but to train people in a way where there's a real awakening of the kinds of recognition of what inclusion and diversity and access really means? What are your thoughts on some of that? Who'd like to speak to that?
Maybe I'll jump in. I think if you want inclusion, you first have to engage. And we've been looking at actually a lot of city-based projects around community health that are private-public partnerships. We've got one going on in Oakland. We have one down in Southern California in Watts County, and another one in Maryland and Baltimore. And one of the most profound learnings from that is we do not know what the real problems are. We actually don't even know what the real solutions are. The people that actually do know is the actual community And until you have engaged them in that discussion and put them in the driver's seat of architecting and designing it, you won't have a solution that will be embraced by the community and be used by the community. A good example is we decided to build a medical office down in Southern California, and we do our usual drive time analysis, and you see where your population is, and this time around we said we're not going to take that traditional approach. We're actually going to bring the community in, and we are going to design it with them. They are going to pick the location. They're going to pick the design. We designed the entire building. By the way, we took out every single patient room. Who wants to wait? 15% of every medical office is actually patient rooms. We removed all that, created public spaces which are open to the public for use to the community. So after hours, it is a community space. It is not Kaiser Permanente's medical office. And it gets better usage too, right? After hours, we close, and the community gets to use this asset. So I think the more we think about our assets as the community assets and co-design, I think that is at the heart of some of the solutions.
Mike, Paul, do you think this would apply to the jobs? I mean, if we're thinking about what are the jobs of the future, to what extent is that surveying a market and doing a top-down analysis, and to what extent is that actually engaging people in the kind of work they want to do in the future?
So I think as we think about jobs in the future, there's certainly industries that you can centralize. If you're just dealing in data, you can have one big data hub somewhere in the country and bring in all the data from all over the country. But there are a lot of industries that are never going to be localized like that. Transportation is always going to have a very large local component. I think healthcare will also have a very large local component. Retail, unfortunately, seems to be moving away from a local component to more e-commerce. But I would encourage those of us that are in these industries that have and will have always local components. I think we really need to think about how we work with the communities going forward. Because there can be a partnership then.
I wonder if the question is what is the future of jobs or what is the future of work?
Yeah.
Because I think the notion of having a job is radically being challenged. I was talking, actually, another professor from Berkeley the other day, and he said, in your parents' generation, they did one job, right? They went to school, studied, and then their entire career was in a single company, if not a single job. Our generation, we will do 4, 5, 6, 7 jobs in our career, and you think about how many times you had to reinvent yourself.
20, 30.
Gemma's got a little slightly different experience. And then she's like, your kids' generation, they'll be doing 5 jobs at the same time. And I'm like, ooh, that's actually a very interesting notion. I think the nature of work is going to change. Absolutely. And we actually have to think about what that is. And I don't even know if the notion of jobs will remain.
Tan, can I bring you in here? Because, you're one of the great inventors of this era of technology. And I think what you spoke to underlines the importance of giving people the direct access to the tools and empowering them with access to the technology through which they can invent. It's one thing to say that we need to have partnerships with community, but if we don't put in the hands of community and democratize access to the tools that will reshape our future, it's a pointless exercise. So how do we do that?
So I think it's very important to ensure that we look at stakeholders beyond shareholders. So I think it's really important as we think about these technologies that can fundamentally reshape not only the environment around us, but can also reshape us as individuals, as a species. We really need to think about how do we think about the overall stakeholders, who needs to participate, and the more people that can participate in the dialogue around how this technology evolves, how it's developed, how is it applied? All of these things are really, really important. So universally affordable technology is very, very important, right? Affordability is one of the key issues that we have. When I started in this space, equipment to measure the brain, electrical signals were in the tens of thousands of dollars. We've slashed that price by an order of 100 magnitude, right? So that makes it less than $1,000 within a few $100s, which makes it already affordable, and we're just getting started. And I think it's really important to recognize that affordability is very important, but making sure that we create tools that allow others to participate. I think, one thing that we can do is recognize the power that we have for change if we apply ourselves at the policy level to thinking about these opportunities. So in the way that we're thinking about data privacy and protection, we can, and incorporate principles of design thinking into that, perhaps there's an opportunity for us to think about inclusion by design, right? Just like we're applying user-centric design to our processes, we can think about how can we incorporate more people into that process? How can we incorporate the human into the loop? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us as we're creating this new technologies, as we're creating this new future, that we take more into consideration than just the technological development and what's possible.
Do others of you think there are opportunities in how you engage in the formation of technology policy?
I think a really critical tool for us for the next couple of decades is going to be around educational software. And what we're seeing now in classrooms throughout the world around blended learning and personalized learning is really critical. And as we think about lowering the barriers for access to tech jobs and tech-enabled jobs, this is going to be really important for us. It needs a very robust conversation between our educational institutions and our employers to really help everyone understand what are the skills that are needed, what's the path to get to those skills, and suddenly we can democratize this higher order learning.
So, one thing that we see happening, you mentioned earlier the struggle around a four-year degree and so on. The older model that we have for the education is that people come in and they're educated for a period of time, and then they go off. And it's very clear that the higher education is going to be a much more dynamic, open process that's more continuous. And so what we see happening, that's why we're trying to integrate what we would call early discovery experiences into the beginning education. And those are experiences that are going to be outside the university for most people. But it'll be part of their early development. And then what we're trying to design our whole system to do is to be a place that people will loop back into periodically as the world around them is changing. And the second, just quick comment on this is, Jen made the comment which really, triggered a thought. She used the phrase tools, and we've had a series of discussions around our campus around what is happening with this abrupt technology transformation and what will happen to employment and so on. And when we've had the people from all the engineering disciplines inventing new tools and the folks from economics and social science together talking about it, they really keyed in on this idea of thinking of these as being intelligent tools as opposed to this kind of mythical robot that replaces a human being. These are really intelligent tools, and those tools are going to be used by people. And the question becomes, what are the uses of those that are, and so at this point, even in the earliest work on trying to invent new technologies, that is the question that people are asking. So they're trying to create, for example, assistive tools that will enable physical therapy to be more precise and systematic so that people will retain mobility. And it turns out that the realization is that that's going to require a whole new group of people who can perform those, who can help that to occur, and so on. So our view, at least on this, is that in partnership with companies, we can have a situation where the early design of the technology or the early conception of the technology is already paired up with thinking about what is going to be a potential avenue for that to be deployed in society at large scale. And that thinking, frankly, hasn't been there inside the technology development inside universities. And I think it's a big transformation in what our education will be like.
I mean, it's exciting. We're really talking about a period of co-creation. I mean, co-creation genuinely from, a really diverse group of people or stakeholders in a way that we haven't really seen. I mean, it makes me want to go back to university. But just as we end the, it's like now. As we come to the end, I want to get us to take a bit of a step back. And one of the things I found really inspiring, and I think has been covered here a lot, is how much leadership there's been shown in even, the last year around the environment. It really seems that people have got this in their sights. We're setting, big ambitious goals over, 10-year horizons, and everyone is going for it. We've got it sorted. I mean, not sorted, let's not over-exaggerate. It's a long way to go. But there's definitely the leadership being shown. And yet, when you look at inequality, it just doesn't feel like there's that momentum, perhaps the commitment, perhaps the clarity of purpose. And I wanted to hear from you, what is the obstacle? What's stopping us getting there? And what would be your appeal to everybody in this room and outside in terms of what it's going to take from all of us to get that commitment to really reduce inequality to the extent that we need to do in a viable time frame?
I guess I think it's moving from it's the transition from philanthropy to co-investment. The notion that there's some enlightened self-interest that can drive a corporation to decide that investing in people, investing in addressing critical needs for people in a community actually matters to the well-being of that company and its shareholders. That's not an obvious link for a lot of folks. As we start to bump up against the constraints here in the Bay Area of growth, it's becoming more apparent, and I suspect, we're certainly seeing those enlightened folks here in the Bay Area, for example, Mark Benioff, who understands that very well, but it's not just about giving away dollars.
Thanks. Itching to build on that, I think if you want change that's sustainable and systemic, you actually have to deal with inequality at multiple levels. You have to think about it at the individual level and what does it mean. When we were putting out a new digital app, a new interface, we tested it with our Medicaid population, and we showed them all the cool graphics and all the buttons you could press, and one lady just stopped us without even going any further. She's like, "Do you know how much of my data plan you're using up? If I can't do something in one button, forget it. I'm not going to use it." I think we really have to be very thoughtful from a design perspective at an individual level, but we also have to target solutions at the city, national level, and those are not always easy in the environment we're in right now, but I think we can. I think that I do feel like there is a coalition of the willing, and there's a lot of leadership behind it.
Well, perhaps one thing that has struck me recently on this is the extent to which the people who are in disadvantaged circumstances themselves want to be part of designing the pathways by which they're going to have opportunity come to them. And one of the more striking conversations that I've had was with a group of that's called the Underground Scholars at Berkeley. These are people who were formerly incarcerated and are now undergraduates at Berkeley. So as youth, they were in detention, and now they're students at Berkeley. And just listening to them about how they think about what the pathways are going to be for us to overcome it was entirely different than when we listened to people who are looking at it from, say, other vantage points that are more advantaged. And so I think that listening and integration of those kinds of ideas matters enormously in terms of being successful in having these things actually be used and deployed. And so one thing that we learned recently, as an example again, is that we're used to thinking of very early education, the preschool and so on, as having had a big impact, but we know that adolescents have a period of enormous development, brain plasticity. They challenge everything around them. That's an opportunity right there in that adolescent period for people who appear not to be on a track to have a good outcome to change, because they want to change everything at that point in life. So we're trying to really think hard and listen to people in our community who come from those kinds of disadvantaged backgrounds and how we could help them to have a better outcome.
Thanks.
So I think your comments are very valid, and it's frustrating, right? The comparison to climate change, for instance, it seems like thinking back over the last few years, we had some basic scientific understanding. We could talk with some certainty about outcomes that are not favorable for anybody on the planet. That in turn started to drive some policy change that has, and the world for the most part, I think, has acknowledged that as an issue that we need to continue to work together on.
One U.S. president aside, of course.
Yeah, exactly. I can't defend the U.S. right now. By the way, I would say we as a company, General Motors, recognize climate change. In inequality, it's different, right? We keep hearing facts, just like you presented to us at the beginning of the discussion, and yet it doesn't seem to be driving the policy discussion at all. And so I think it does fall to a much more local conversation. And when you ask, what should all of us take home as a challenge, I think it is a local conversation. Wherever your company operates, are you making that community better? And what are you doing to try and address inequality, both today and going forward, knowing that we are in the fourth industrial revolution, and what exactly work looks like on the other side of that is somewhat uncertain. But a group of really smart people like this and the other people in industry and in the communities, I think if we start spending some time on it, we can lay out ways to address this going forward. But I don't see, certainly not in the US, any high-level policy being put in place that's going to address inequality.
I agree with what you're saying. I think access and opportunity are the key vectors for driving inclusion, right? And maybe what we need to do around the co-investment is to really rethink what it means to co-invest, and to not just think about the financial resources alone. If we don't, let's look at what our asset base is. So for some of our companies who have skill sets, perhaps it is that we can devote our skills. Maybe it is that we have data that's very valuable. Maybe we can find ways to provide that for social impact. Perhaps it's some derivative algorithm that can be used for social impact and social inclusion. So I think perhaps being able to reframe some of the ideology around how do we invest and what can we invest could allow us to do more in terms of social inclusion as well.
Thank you very much to my wonderful panel. So if you're asking yourselves, what can you do? You can invest in cities. You can go and get your senior leadership right back to the grassroots and co-create with and not for communities. You can partner with research institutions and ensure that students from the very get-go get the kind of practical relationships with you that can also help your business. You can provide those local experiences and also be part of a generation of future forecasters for what kind of jobs will come next. And you can ensure that the technologies that you yourselves will generate and be in custody of will be open access and available to all. Thank you very, very much. I wish you all very, very well in your efforts, and thank everybody here today. Back over to you.